The morning of March 22nd, 1943, Lieutenant Commander Peter Gretton stood on the bridge of HMS Duncan, his hands gripping the rail as he watched the torpedo wake slice through the grey Atlantic water. It was moving at 45 knots, a white line of disturbed water pointing directly at his destroyer's hull like an accusing finger. Every instinct, every hour of training, every naval manual he had ever read told him the same thing. Turn away, present the stern, run from the danger racing toward him at nearly a mile per minute. He ordered the helm hard over toward the torpedo. The helmsman hesitated for a fraction of a second, his hands frozen on the wheel. Officers on the bridge turned to stare. One junior lieutenant opened his mouth to protest, then closed it. Gretton stood motionless, watching the wake, calculating angles in his head while his ship heeled into the turn. The destroyer swung its bow toward the approaching torpedo, accelerating into what should have been certain destruction. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The torpedo passed 70 yards astern, missing completely. The U-boat commander, somewhere beneath the waves 3 miles distant, had calculated his firing solution, based on the assumption that Gretton would do what every destroyer captain did. Turn away. The German had aimed at where Duncan would be if she ran. Instead, Duncan had charged forward, crossed the predicted track early, and left the torpedo to spend itself in empty ocean. Gretton had not invented this maneuver that morning. He had learned it through bitter experience, through watching other ships die because they had done the logical thing, through understanding that U-boat commanders were not firing at ships but at mathematical predictions. What looked like steering into danger was actually steering out of a calculated trap. The torpedo wakes that seemed to chase destroyers were already committed to a fixed course the moment they left their tubes. They could not turn, could not adjust, could not compensate for a target that refused to behave as expected. This counterintuitive tactic, this deliberate violation of survival instinct, would become one of the most closely guarded and least understood secrets of the Battle of the Atlantic. Destroyer captains who employed it found that U-boats missed them with impossible consistency. U-boat commanders who encountered it reported their torpedo failures to headquarters with genuine confusion, unable to explain how perfect firing solutions resulted in clean misses. The mathematics were correct. The execution was flawless. The torpedoes should have hit. But they did not hit, because the fundamental assumption underlying every torpedo attack had been invalidated. U-boat commanders calculated where ships would be. Destroyer captains learned to be somewhere else. The method seemed like madness. It felt like suicide. It violated every natural human impulse toward self-preservation. And it worked, over and over, in convoy battle after convoy battle across the killing grounds of the North Atlantic. The story of how this tactic developed, why it functioned, and what it meant for the men who employed it begins not with destroyers at all, but with the weapons designed to sink them. The German G7, a torpedo, the standard weapon carried by Type 7 U-boats in 1943, was a precisely engineered instrument of destruction. It measured 23 feet 4 inches in length and 21 inches in diameter. It weighed 3,386 pounds, fully loaded, of which 617 pounds was the hexanite warhead, powerful enough to break a freighter's back or tear a destroyer's hull open to the sea. The weapon cost approximately 30,000 Reichsmarks to manufacture, roughly equivalent to $15,000 in American currency at the time, making each torpedo more expensive than a luxury automobile. The torpedo ran on compressed air and alcohol, a combination that powered its engine to speeds of 44 knots for a range of 7,540 yards at maximum speed, or 30 knots for nearly 14,000 yards at economical settings. These were not theoretical specifications. They were verified performance figures confirmed through thousands of test firings and combat launches. A U-boat could fire this weapon from depths up to 50 meters, though most attacks occurred from periscope depth at 12 to 20 meters, where the commander could observe his target and calculate his firing solution. The firing solution was everything. A torpedo could not be aimed like a gun. It had to be launched at a specific angle, at a specific moment, based on the target's course, speed, and distance. Get any variable wrong by even a small margin, and the torpedo would pass harmlessly ahead or astern of the target. The mathematics involved were complex but well understood. German torpedo officers trained for months to master the calculations, using mechanical computers aboard the submarine to solve the equations in real time during an attack. The basic principle was straightforward. Imagine a triangle. The submarine occupies one point, firing a torpedo along one side. The target ship travels along another side at a steady course and speed. The torpedo must reach the point where those two sides intersect, arriving at the exact moment the ship arrives. To calculate this intercept point, the U-boat commander needed three pieces of information: the target's bearing, the target's course angle relative to the submarine, and the target's speed. Bearing was simple to determine. The commander observed the target through his periscope and read the bearing directly from his instruments. Course angle, called the angle on the bow in naval terminology, required more skill. The commander had to estimate whether the target was presenting its bow, beam, or stern, and by what degree. A target heading directly toward the submarine presented a 0-degree angle on the bow. A target showing its full side, beam on, presented a 90-degree angle. A target heading away presented angles between 90 and 180 degrees. Speed was the most difficult variable to determine accurately. The commander estimated speed by observing the bow wave, the wake, and how quickly the target crossed his field of view. Experienced commanders could estimate speed within 2 or 3 knots for most merchant vessels, which travelled at predictable speeds between 8 and 12 knots. Warships were more challenging because they could maintain higher speeds and change speed rapidly, but destroyers on convoy escort duty typically cruised at 15 to 18 knots to conserve fuel, speeds within the estimation capabilities of skilled submarine commanders. With these three variables known or estimated, the torpedo officer fed the information into the submarine's mechanical computer, a device called the Torpedo Vorhaltrechner, or torpedo deflection calculator. This analog computer, a masterpiece of German engineering, mechanically solved the triangle problem. It calculated the angle at which the torpedo must be fired ahead of the target, so that weapon and ship would arrive at the same point simultaneously. This angle, called the torpedo deflection angle or lead angle, was transmitted to the torpedo tubes, which were trained to the calculated bearing. When the submarine reached the correct firing position, the commander gave the order and the torpedo launched. From September 1939 through the end of 1941, German U-boats sank thousands of Allied merchant ships using these calculations. Convoy routes across the Atlantic became known as Torpedo Alley. Ships exploded and sank so frequently that merchant sailors began to view each voyage as a death sentence. The mathematics were on the Germans' side. British and American merchant captains, lacking proper escort and sailing in predictable patterns, were simply targets moving through a calculated field of fire. But the system contained a fundamental vulnerability that neither German torpedo designers nor U-boat commanders initially recognized. Every calculation assumed the target would maintain its course and speed from the moment the firing solution was calculated until the torpedo reached the intercept point. This assumption was entirely reasonable. Ships at sea, particularly heavily laden merchant vessels in convoy, did not make sudden course changes. They could not accelerate rapidly. They followed assigned routes at steady speeds. The human operators of those vessels behaved predictably because they had to behave predictably to maintain station in convoy and follow the designated route. Destroyer escorts were different. They were fast, maneuverable, and under aggressive command. They could change course in seconds, accelerate from 15 knots to 30 knots in under a minute, and execute violent evasive maneuvers that would scatter a merchant convoy. But in 1940 and 1941, destroyer captains did not yet understand what they were evading. When they spotted a torpedo wake approaching their ship, they did what seemed logical. They turned away, presenting the stern, attempting to outrun the weapon or let it pass down their side. This maneuver sometimes worked through sheer luck, or if the initial firing solution had been poor. More often, it did exactly what the U-boat commander expected, placing the destroyer precisely where the torpedo was aimed. The German submarine service developed specific tactics for engaging escorts. When attacking a convoy, U-boat commanders were trained to fire first at the escorts if they presented good angles, eliminating the defending warships before turning on the helpless merchant vessels. A standard approach involved calculating two firing solutions simultaneously, one for the primary target and one for any escort that might be in position to interfere. If a destroyer turned toward the submarine during an attack approach, the commander would shift to the escort, calculate a quick firing solution based on the destroyer's observed course and speed, and fire a spread of torpedoes timed to catch the escort as it closed. Commander Donald McIntyre of the Royal Navy first observed the pattern in December 1940, while commanding HMS Walker as senior officer of the 5th Escort Group. McIntyre was a career naval officer who had entered Dartmouth Naval College in 1919 at age 13, the traditional entry age for British naval cadets. By 1940, he had accumulated 21 years of naval experience, including extensive service in WWII destroyers. He understood ship handling, convoy escort tactics, and the capabilities of his vessel with the intimate knowledge that comes from years at sea. HMS Walker was a V and W class destroyer, one of the older vessels pressed into escort service after the fall of France, stripped Britain of access to French naval bases, and forced a complete reorganization of Atlantic convoy protection. Walker displaced 1,100 tons standard, could make 34 knots at full power, and carried a main armament of 4 4.7-inch guns plus anti-submarine weapons, including depth charges, and the newly installed Type 123 sonar set. The sonar was primitive by later standards but revolutionary for its time, allowing escorts to detect submerged submarines at ranges up to 1,500 yards under good conditions. McIntyre's escort group operated in the western approaches, the sea lanes southwest of Ireland, where convoys from North America made their final approach to British ports. This area was known to the U-boat service as the Black Pit, the gap in mid-ocean where convoys sailed beyond the range of land-based air cover and were vulnerable to wolf-pack attacks. In November and December 1940, U-boat strength in the Atlantic had grown to approximately 30 boats operational at any given time, and their commanders were becoming increasingly aggressive in their tactics. On the night of December 19th, Walker was screening convoy HX-90 when sonar contact was made on a U-boat, attempting to penetrate the convoy's defensive screen. McIntyre maneuvered Walker to attack, forcing the submarine deep with a pattern of depth charges set to detonate at 150 feet. The U-boat, later identified as U-101, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Fritz Frauenheim, survived the initial attack and attempted to reposition for a torpedo shot at Walker. McIntyre saw the torpedo wake in the moonlight, a phosphorescent trail, running at shallow depth approximately 400 yards from his ship. His immediate instinct was to turn away, to present the stern and attempt to outrun or evade. But something made him hesitate. He had been calculating angles and speeds in his head throughout the engagement, maintaining an instinctive awareness of where the U-boat must be positioned to launch its attack. If the submarine commander had fired at Walker's current position and course, turning away would carry Walker directly into the torpedo's calculated path. The weapon was not aimed at where Walker was at the moment of firing. It was aimed at where Walker would be 30 seconds later, assuming Walker maintained course or turned predictably. McIntyre ordered the helm hard to starboard, toward the torpedo wake. Walker heeled into the turn, accelerating as her engines responded to the telegraph signal for maximum revolutions. The torpedo passed down the port side, missing by what observers estimated as less than 50 yards. It should have hit. The geometry of the attack had been nearly perfect, but the torpedo had been fired at a prediction, and McIntyre had invalidated that prediction by refusing to behave as expected. This was not the first time McIntyre had observed torpedo failures, but it was the first time he consciously connected the failure to his own maneuvering decision. Over the following weeks, he began to develop a theory about torpedo evasion that contradicted everything taught in peacetime naval training. The standard doctrine for torpedo evasion emphasized turning away from the attack, maintaining maximum speed, and presenting the smallest target profile. McIntyre's experience suggested the opposite approach might be more effective: turn toward the threat, cross the predicted track early, and deny the torpedo the opportunity to reach its calculated intercept point. The mathematics supporting McIntyre's theory were straightforward once the underlying principles were understood. A torpedo fired from 3,000 yards at 44 knots required approximately 2 minutes and 30 seconds to reach its target. During those 150 seconds, a destroyer traveling at 20 knots would cover approximately 1,000 yards. The U-boat commander calculated his firing solution at the moment of launch, aiming the torpedo not at the ship's current position, but at the point where the ship would be 150 seconds in the future, assuming steady course and speed. This created a window of vulnerability that lasted from the moment of firing until the torpedo reached its intercept point. If the target ship changed course or speed at any time during this window, the torpedo would miss because it could not adjust its course after launch. The earlier in the window the ship maneuvered, the greater the miss distance, because the torpedo would continue on its calculated bearing for the full 2.5 minutes, moving further from the maneuvering target with each passing second. A destroyer captain who spotted a torpedo wake had perhaps 20 to 30 seconds to react before the weapon reached lethal range. If he turned away, he would initially open the distance, but his ship would continue moving along or near the line the U-boat commander had calculated. The torpedo, running faster than the destroyer, would eventually close the gap and might still achieve a hit, particularly if the firing solution had included a margin for evasive action. If the captain turned toward the torpedo track, he would actually close the distance initially, but he would cross the calculated intercept line much earlier than predicted, placing his ship ahead of the torpedo's intended target point. The torpedo would pass astern, its sophisticated guidance calculations rendered useless by the simple fact that the target had arrived early and departed before the weapon got there. The psychological barrier to this maneuver was immense. Every human instinct recoils from steering toward danger. Merchant sailors who survived torpedo attacks reported the moment of seeing the wake as one of pure terror, a visceral understanding that death was racing toward them through the water at impossible speed. The natural human response was to run, to put distance between oneself and the threat, to turn away and hope. Destroyer captains were trained naval officers with years of experience, but they were still human beings with the same survival instincts. Deliberately steering their ships and their crews toward an incoming torpedo required a conscious override of every natural impulse. It required something else as well: absolute confidence in the theory. A captain who hesitated, who began the turn toward the threat but then second-guessed himself and reversed the maneuver, would place his ship in the worst possible position. The mathematics only worked if the captain committed fully to the aggressive turn and maintained it until his ship had crossed the torpedo's predicted track. Half measures would fail, hesitation would kill. The maneuver demanded decisiveness, born from intellectual conviction that the theory was correct, even when every nerve in the captain's body screamed that it was suicide. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The first captains to employ the maneuver consistently were those who had survived enough torpedo attacks to develop an intuitive understanding of how U-boat commanders thought. They recognized that submarine warfare was fundamentally a mathematical exercise, that torpedoes were fired at calculations rather than ships, and that disrupting the calculation was more effective than simply trying to outrun the weapon. These captains became evangelists for the new tactic, explaining the theory to other escort commanders during convoy conferences and recommending it in after-action reports. But the tactics spread slowly, hindered by skepticism, by institutional resistance to doctrine that contradicted decades of peacetime training, and by the simple fact that it felt wrong. The definitive test of McIntyre's theory came on the night of March 17, 1941, during the defence of convoy HX-112. The convoy had departed Halifax, Nova Scotia, on March 5th, with 41 merchant ships carrying war materials, food, and fuel to Britain. McIntyre's 5th Escort Group, consisting of Walker and 4 other escorts, met the convoy south of Iceland on March 15th and assumed protective screening positions. By March 17th, the convoy was approximately 400 miles south of Iceland, deep in the Black Pit, where U-boat attacks were most frequent. At 2100 hours, sonar operators aboard Walker detected a submarine contact at 1200 yards, bearing 270 degrees. McIntyre ordered Walker to investigate, maneuvering the destroyer toward the contact while the other escorts maintained their positions around the convoy. As Walker closed the range, the submarine dove deep, attempting to slip away beneath the destroyer. McIntyre ordered a depth charge pattern set for 200 feet, dropping 8 charges in a systematic search pattern designed to bracket the submarine's probable location. The U-boat was U-99, commanded by Captain Lieutenant Otto Kretschmer, one of the most successful submarine commanders in the German Navy. Kretschmer had sunk 44 ships totaling 281,000 tons since the war began, making him the 3rd highest-scoring U-boat ace in history. He was experienced, aggressive, and thoroughly familiar with British escort tactics. When Walker's depth charges detonated near his position, Kretschmer went deep to 300 feet and attempted to escape at slow speed to minimize noise from his electric motors. McIntyre maintained sonar contact throughout the evasion attempt. Walker tracked the submarine for 2 hours, dropping 5 additional depth charge patterns that progressively damaged U-99's pressure hull and forced Kretschmer to surface. The submarine broke the surface at 23:35 hours, approximately 5 miles from Walker's position. McIntyre ordered maximum speed and turned toward the surfaced submarine, intending to ram. Kretschmer, recognizing his boat was disabled and sinking, attempted one final attack. U-99's bow torpedo tubes were still operational. At a range of approximately 2,000 yards, Kretschmer fired his last 2 torpedoes at Walker, calculating a hasty firing solution based on the destroyer's bearing and speed. The torpedoes ran true, their wakes visible in the moonlight as phosphorescent lines converging on Walker's position. McIntyre saw both wakes simultaneously. Standard doctrine would have called for turning away, presenting the stern, attempting to outrun weapons fired from such close range. Instead, McIntyre ordered full rudder toward the torpedo tracks, swinging Walker's bow directly toward U-99 and directly into the paths of the approaching torpedoes. Officers on Walker's bridge shouted warnings. The crew braced for impact. The ship heeled violently as it turned at maximum speed, its hull shuddering from the strain of the high-speed maneuver. Both torpedoes missed. One passed down Walker's port side at an estimated distance of 30 yards. The second passed under the keel amidships, running too deep to detonate its magnetic influence fuse. Walker charged through the torpedo tracks, crossed the space where Kretschmer's calculations had predicted the destroyer would be, and continued accelerating toward the crippled submarine. At 50 yards distance, Kretschmer ordered his crew to abandon ship. U-99 sank at 0045 hours on March 18th. Walker rescued 40 survivors, including Kretschmer, who became a prisoner of war. McIntyre's action report from convoy HX-112 reached Western Approaches Command in Liverpool on March 20th, 1941. The report documented the entire engagement with U-99, including the specific details of the final torpedo evasion. Range, bearing, the decision to turn toward rather than away from the attack, and the successful outcome. Captain George Creasy, Director of Anti-Submarine Warfare at the Admiralty, read the report with particular interest. Creasy had been analysing torpedo attack patterns for months, collecting data from convoy battles across the Atlantic, searching for tactical innovations that might reduce merchant ship losses. The report was circulated to escort group commanders throughout the Western Approaches Command. Creasy attached a memorandum recommending that destroyer captains consider aggressive maneuvering toward torpedo attacks rather than conventional evasion. The memorandum was carefully worded, suggesting rather than ordering the tactic, acknowledging that it contradicted established doctrine and required judgment from individual commanders. But the seed was planted. Escort commanders began discussing the theory during convoy conferences. Some remained skeptical. Others, particularly those who had survived torpedo attacks through what they had assumed was luck, began to recognize a pattern in their own experiences. Commander Frederick Walker, no relation to HMS Walker but commanding officer of HMS Stork and later one of the most successful U-boat hunters of the war, adopted the aggressive turn tactic after studying McIntyre's report. Walker commanded the 36th Escort Group, which operated primarily in the western approaches and along the Gibraltar convoy routes. Between December 1941 and July 1943, Walker's group sank 6 U-boats and damaged numerous others. In multiple engagements, Walker personally employed the turn-toward maneuver when under torpedo attack, crediting the tactic with saving his ship on at least 3 documented occasions. The tactic's effectiveness became statistically measurable by mid-1942. The Admiralty's Anti-Submarine Warfare Division maintained detailed records of convoy battles, including torpedo attacks against escorts, hit rates, and evasion tactics employed. Analysis of these records revealed a clear pattern. escorts that turned away from torpedo attacks experienced hit rates of approximately 12% when torpedoes were fired at ranges under 2,000 yards. Escorts that turned toward attacks experienced hit rates of approximately 3% under similar conditions. The difference was stark enough that by late 1942, aggressive maneuvering toward torpedo wakes became standard doctrine in Royal Navy escort training. American destroyer commanders learned the tactic from British counterparts during joint convoy operations. The United States Navy entered the Atlantic escort war in earnest in mid-1941, when President Roosevelt declared the Western Hemisphere neutral zone and authorized U. destroyers to escort convoys as far as Iceland. American destroyer captains trained alongside British escorts, participated in convoy conferences, and absorbed tactical lessons from officers who had been fighting U-boats for 2 years. The aggressive turn toward torpedoes was one of those lessons, passed informally from experienced British commanders to their American counterparts during operational briefings and social gatherings ashore. Lieutenant Commander Eugene Sarsfield, commanding USS Bory, a Clemson-class destroyer transferred to Atlantic escort duty in September 1941, recorded his first experience with the tactic in his ship's log on November 3, 1941. Bory was screening convoy HX-156 when sonar detected a U-boat attempting to penetrate the screen. During the subsequent engagement, the submarine fired a single torpedo at Bory from approximately 1,500 yards. Sarsfield, who had discussed McIntyre's tactic with British officers 2 weeks earlier in Reykjavik, ordered full rudder toward the torpedo wake. The weapon missed by an estimated 40 yards. Sarsfield's log entry noted that the maneuver felt unnatural, but that the mathematics made sense once he had committed to the turn. German U-boat commanders began reporting anomalous torpedo failures with increasing frequency in late 1941 and throughout 1942. War diaries recovered after the war reveal a pattern of confusion and frustration among submarine captains who had executed perfect firing solutions only to watch their torpedoes miss inexplicably. Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Suren, commanding U-564, reported in his war diary from April 1942 that he had fired 3 torpedoes at a destroyer escort at a range of 1,200 meters with an angle on the bow of 60 degrees, conditions that should have guaranteed at least 1 hit. All 3 torpedoes missed astern. Suren's diary entry expressed bewilderment, noting that the destroyer had turned toward his position rather than away, a maneuver he initially interpreted as an attempt to ram, but which resulted in the destroyer crossing ahead of the torpedo tracks. The German Torpedo Office, Torpedoversuchsanstalt, received hundreds of similar reports during 1942. Technical investigations examined whether torpedo guidance systems were malfunctioning, whether magnetic influence fuses were detonating prematurely or failing to detonate at all, and whether the basic performance specifications of the weapons had somehow degraded. Extensive testing at torpedo ranges in the Baltic revealed no systematic failures. The weapons performed exactly as designed. The problem was not technical, it was tactical. Allied escorts were no longer behaving predictably. U-boat headquarters issued tactical guidance in October 1942, recommending that commanders fire larger spreads of torpedoes at escort vessels to increase probability of hits despite evasive maneuvering. A spread typically consisted of 3 to 5 torpedoes fired at intervals of 2 to 3 seconds, each aimed at slightly different points along the target's predicted track. The theory was that even if the target maneuvered aggressively, at least 1 torpedo from the spread would achieve a hit. In practice, this tactic consumed torpedo inventory rapidly, without corresponding increases in success rates. Escorts that turned aggressively toward attacks would cross ahead of the entire spread, invalidating all the carefully calculated firing solutions simultaneously. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat force, recognized by early 1943 that Allied escorts had developed effective torpedo evasion tactics. His response was to shift U-boat targeting priority away from escorts and focus almost exclusively on merchant vessels. New tactical instructions issued in March 1943 directed U-boat commanders to avoid engaging escorts unless absolutely necessary for convoy penetration. The primary mission was sinking merchant tonnage, not fighting naval battles with increasingly effective destroyer escorts. This shift in targeting priority represented an implicit acknowledgement that the torpedo, Germany's primary submarine weapon, had become significantly less effective against alert, well-handled warships. The psychological impact on U-boat crews was considerable. Submarine warfare required enormous courage under any circumstances, operating submerged in a steel tube under crushing water pressure, hunted by escorts equipped with sonar and depth charges. The knowledge that their primary weapon was losing effectiveness against escorts added another layer of stress. U-boat crewmen who survived the war and were later interviewed by historians recalled the period from mid-1942 onward as marking a fundamental shift in the Battle of the Atlantic. Before that point, U-boats had been hunters. After that point, increasingly, they became the hunted. Escort groups grew more numerous, better trained, and tactically superior. Air coverage extended further into mid-Atlantic, and the escorts themselves had learned how to defeat the torpedo, the weapon that had made U-boats effective commerce raiders in the first place. The tactic that destroyer captains learned through bitter experience, validated through mathematical analysis, and adopted through institutional change, saved hundreds of ships and thousands of lives during the Battle of the Atlantic. Precise numbers are impossible to calculate because we cannot know how many ships would have been sunk had escorts continued employing conventional evasion tactics. But the statistical evidence from Admiralty records suggests the impact was substantial. Torpedo hit rates against escorts declined from approximately 12% in 1941 to approximately 3% by 1943, while the number of torpedo attacks actually increased as U-boat numbers peaked. The human cost of learning this lesson was paid in the ships that were sunk before the tactic became standard practice. HMS Cossack torpedoed on October 23, 1941, while escorting convoy HG-75. HMS Audacity, the first British escort carrier, torpedoed on December 21, 1941, during a night attack by U-751. USS Reuben James torpedoed on October 31, 1941, while escorting convoy HX-156, becoming the first U.S. Navy vessel sunk in the war with the loss of 115 men. Each of these ships, and dozens of others, were lost to torpedoes that might have missed had their captains known to turn toward, rather than away from the attack. The survivors of those sinkings, the men who spent hours in frigid Atlantic water waiting for rescue, who watched their shipmates die from hypothermia or drown in fuel oil, paid a personal price for institutional learning. They were the casualties of a tactical gap, the lag time between when a better method becomes theoretically possible and when it becomes standard practice. Naval warfare, like all warfare, is learned through experience. The lessons are written in loss. The improvements are measured in lives saved after previous lives were spent learning what not to do. For the destroyer captains who mastered the aggressive turn, the tactic became instinctive. Commander Peter Gretton, who opened this story, survived the war having commanded escorts through 44 Atlantic convoys. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Order and 2 bars, recognition of repeated acts of exceptional leadership under combat conditions. In his post-war memoir, Convoy Escort Commander, Gretton described the turn toward torpedoes as the most counterintuitive maneuver he ever had to execute and the most consistently effective. Every time he employed it, he wrote, he experienced a moment of primal fear as his ship swung toward the approaching weapon. Every time, the torpedo missed because he had refused to be where the U-boat commander calculated he would be. The tactic represented a profound psychological shift in how destroyer captains understood their tactical situation. They learned to think like their adversaries, to understand that U-boat commanders were firing at predictions rather than targets, and to exploit the fundamental limitation of the torpedo. Once launched, it could not adjust its course. This required intellectual discipline to override survival instinct, mathematical confidence to trust the geometry of the maneuver, and moral courage to steer toward danger. The captains who possessed these qualities saved their ships. The captains who learned them too late, or never learned them at all, often did not survive to apply the knowledge. By 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic had turned decisively in favor of the Allies. More escorts, better tactics, extended air coverage, improved sonar, breaking of German naval codes, and a dozen other factors contributed to the victory. But among those factors, recorded in convoy reports and escort commander memoirs and U-boat war diaries recovered after the war, was the simple fact that destroyer captains had learned to zigzag into torpedoes rather than away from them. What looked like madness was actually mathematics. What felt like suicide was actually survival. And what seemed like steering into danger was actually the safest course available to men who understood that their enemies were aiming at predictions, not ships. Lieutenant Commander Peter Gretton, standing on HMS Duncan's bridge on that grey March morning in 1943, ordering his helmsman to turn toward the torpedo wake racing toward his ship, understood this truth in his bones. The torpedo passed astern, his ship survived, his crew lived, and somewhere beneath the waves, 3 miles distant, a U-boat commander stared through his periscope at an impossible miss, unable to comprehend how perfect calculations had produced complete failure. The mathematics were correct. The execution was flawless. The torpedo should have hit, but it did not hit, because the destroyer captain had learned to think like a submarine commander, to predict the prediction, and to be somewhere else. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.